Rachel Whiteman. That's my important bio today. I'm just grateful that you all are willing to come out on this night and get into an important conversation and also celebrate the hard work of writing a book and publishing a book that Rachel has accomplished here. As someone who has read the book, I highly recommend it. There will be books for sale, and I have 2 books here for whoever's birthday it is closest to today. So whose birthday is closest to today? It wouldn't be a fun party without a giveaway, right? Whose birthday is in June or May? Someone here? Okay. Oh, when's your birthday? 14th? May 12th, okay. Oh, that's really close. June 2nd? Okay, awesome. Can you deliver these books? This is why Ramon's in the front row. These ladies. Happy birthday! Happy birthday! So tonight I'm going to introduce Rachel and just share a little bit of how this book came to be. And then we have this wonderful panel that's going to come up, and we're going to get to hear from them. And we've prepared some questions in advance because we want to keep the panel to a good, tight time frame so that we have some time to head across the hall where we have some refreshments, and Rachel will be able to sell books and sign books, and any questions or conversation you can take into that room with the panelists and others today. Our hope for you today is that you are able to leave with just a little bit more thoughtfulness and some tools and some intentional ways to think about how we consume information wisely. That's our hope for tonight, and I think that with knowing these panelists and Rachel, that this will be true. Rachel starts out in the book with an intentional reflection on Scripture, and I thought I would start off by reading that to you all today as a way of honoring how she started the book before we have this conversation. And she says a helpful starting point for her is Ephesians 4:14 through 16. And she's encouraging people as you listen to this to think about how, as people of faith, and maybe all of you here are representing different faiths potentially, but for those of us who are representing a faith in Jesus, how are we representing that in the spaces we find ourselves? And how can we be thoughtful about that? And so recognizing that we can apply our Christian framework to our information-seeking habits. How about that? And so Ephesians 4:14 through 16. Then we will no longer be immature like children. We won't be tossed and blown about by every wind of new teaching. We will not be influenced when people try to trick us with lies so clever they sound like the truth. Instead, we will speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of his body, the church. He makes the whole body fit together perfectly, as each part does its own special work. It helps the other parts grow, so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. And so that's our reflection for tonight as we go into this conversation about how we get to be people who love our neighbors through being wise with how we consume and share information. That's at the core of this, and at the core of the heart of Jesus, who gives us the invitation to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves as the most important things we can do as followers of his. So without further ado, can you welcome up our author tonight, Rachel Whiteman? Now, Rachel, before we have the rest of the panel come up, I thought for anyone who's here wondering, how would this book come about? Why would someone put this time and energy into this? I know you wrote about it a little bit at the beginning of the book, but why are we here? How did this happen?
Well, I'll try to keep that short. This book actually started as a workshop. Some of you were in my very first workshop that I offered here at Mill City. Back in 2019, I asked Pastor Steph, could I offer a workshop on information seeking? I'm a librarian, for those of you that don't know me, so we're not actually going to talk about books tonight, except my book. And I asked Pastor Steph, could I offer this workshop on how to find information, how to seek truth? That came out of a lot of conversations I had. And she let me. And some of you are here tonight that were in that first class, and I apologize because I feel like that first class was not my best.
It was a rough draft. It was a rough draft.
And then from there, that was a 6-week class, and that last week of that class, we were all like, COVID is coming. Mm-hmm. And then COVID happened. It was 2020. And the world just feels like it's changed so much.
Yeah.
And I had the opportunity to continue offering that class with over a dozen churches in the last few years, mostly online, but also in person. And from that, I had the opportunity to write this book. When I started doing those workshops, I was really looking for content that would help bridge the gap between spiritual information and spiritual content, and then also this information literacy or media literacy that I talk about in my profession. And there really wasn't a lot of content that brought those two worlds together. So this book is really, I hope, bridging that gap. And it came out of a lot of workshops. A lot of you have sat in those workshops. A lot of you talked through this content with me. Some of you were why I even started thinking about this in the first place. So it came out of those workshops, and I had a connection with someone from college. She connected me to someone at Erdman's, the publisher, which then I was able to write this book in the end of 2021 and into 2022. It's crazy to me because I finished this book a year ago, and it's just now getting into everyone's hands, which is really exciting.
Something else was happening during the time you were writing the book.
Mm-hmm.
You were.
I was pregnant.
Yes. There was words that were coming forth, and
yes.
Also then.
Yes, I finished this manuscript 2 weeks after my son was born, and my editor emailed me in March and said, "Okay, what do you think's going to happen here?" I was like, "We're fine. The baby's not here yet." The next day I went into labor, and so then it was not quite when I was hoping, but it really, to me, is very closely intertwined with my journey into motherhood. But it's been really fun to it was a fun opportunity, and it pushed me to get that book done as fast as possible.
We won't get too into the metaphor of pushing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Good.
Yes.
Great. Well, with that, can we introduce our panelists? Come on up. Can you give a round of applause for our panelists as they come up? I'm just really grateful for these folks' willingness to come up, and I think yesterday I sent them some questions. So just making sure they didn't overthink it, Like I didn't want them to have too long to think about these questions, but thank you all. I have a quick bio I'd like to read about each of them so you know a little bit more about them, and then we'll launch right into the questions that we have prepared. So we'll first start with Pastor Gary, who's sitting here next to me. Gary Dawkins serves as the lead pastor of Mercy Vineyard Church here in Northeast Minneapolis, just on the same street, but down that way a little bit. Gary guides the church in growing as a loving family and sharing that godly love with the greater community. He's passionate about discipleship, community care, and justice, and wants to see all people flourish. Gary holds an MBA from Syracuse University and an MS in Communications Management from Morgan State University, and has added Northeastern Seminary and Capital Bible Seminary. He loves to cook, is an avid reader, and among his favorite things is playing Monopoly with his wife, Lakita, and his daughter, Grace. I didn't know the Monopoly part. That was a fun surprise. So can we welcome Pastor Gary? I'm not going to play Monopoly with you. That's not going to go well for me. All right, and then next we have Ben Holson. He's the Director of Programming for Faith Radio, a ministry of the University of Northwestern St. Paul, with 28 radio signals and growing listeners in every state because of the free Faith Radio app. God is also using Faith Radio podcasts to reach 170 countries around the world every week. Ben is passionate about Jesus with an insatiable desire to help Christian communicators communicate more effectively and efficiently. He and his wife, Karen, is it Karen? Nice. Have a 3-year-old daughter who brings them pure joy while keeping them busy. Together they attend Mercy Vineyard Church in Northeast Minneapolis. We're a little biased, but here we are. And we're glad you're here. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you very much.
I will now share a little bit more than what Rachel shared about herself. Rachel is a librarian, an educator, and a believer in integrating faith and fact checking. She is the Associate Director for Instruction and Outreach at Concordia University, St. Paul. Rachel has a master's degree in Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. Prior to moving to Minnesota in 2012, she served as a librarian and missionary in Kampala, Uganda. She and her husband Brian and their son James live in Northeast Minneapolis and are members of Mill City Church. Welcome again, Rachel. And then we have Elizabeth Schachman, has worked in television, newspaper, and radio journalism for 14 years. She's currently the education journalist at Minnesota Public Radio, where she reports on schools, teachers, students, education inequalities, and Minnesota's $23 billion education budget, $23 billion education budget. That's something to report on. That's lots of details.
It's a lot of details.
It's a lot of details. I love listening to the updates that Elizabeth gives because our church has been very involved in education and public education. And so I just think you've done a great job highlighting what's going on. And so thank you. Welcome, Elizabeth. And then finally, we have John McTaggart here on the end. In 2021, John retired from American Public Media Group after 10 years as CEO. So he and his wife could move to Fargo, North Dakota, which we're not going to hold against him, even though, oh, sorry, that wasn't in the notes. He moved to Fargo, North Dakota to help care for their aging parents. He is now an executive consultant with the Platinum Group, advising founders, owners, and CEOs to find new paths to grow their business, manage big disruptions, and navigate complex transitions. He also teaches a capstone course in the entrepreneurship program of the Offutt School of Business at Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. Welcome, John. Well, hopefully you can see why I was so excited to be able to offer the chance for us to hear from this wonderful panel. And so we'll jump right into some of the questions that we have. And as you're listening, if there's questions that come up in your mind, I do encourage you maybe to write them down. Even though we won't be able to address them here, there'll be some time to discuss afterwards. And perhaps there are questions you might want to take with you into the conversations you're having from here. Hint, hint, we hope you take this and have conversations from here. So the first question, I'm going to ask Rachel to answer the first question as our woman of the night. Rachel, you start in the beginning of the book talking about this idea of the information landscape and how it has been shaped by the internet as well as many different media outlets. And so, first of all, I want to talk a little bit more about this, but I forgot. We wanted to just do some definitions really quick. So Rachel has some definitions before she even answers this first question. Let's put them up here on the screen so everybody can see them. So we've got these 4 definitions just to make sure we're all on the same page about what we mean by these things. So I'll read to you what they say. So online spaces, this is all the places you access on the internet. Okay? So apps, websites, email, social media, etc. So it can mean anything. When we say online spaces, we're using that pretty broadly. Information landscape, that's why I remembered that we needed to do that, because the information landscape, the range of information that you can access, from movie reviews to news to medical research, there's a lot of different, the range of information that we can connect with. Then there's misinformation, information that is out of context, false and or inaccurate, and then disinformation, information that is intentionally false or misleading. So you can see how those last 2 could be a little bit confused. So we'll try to be intentional with how we use those words tonight to the best of our ability. So Rachel, in light of these definitions, we see widespread misinformation and disinformation in our life. How did we get here? What do you think are the main factors that led us to this moment where we would even think it's important to have this conversation or write a book about it?
Yeah, I think this is kind of what prompted me to think about these workshops and this book. The information landscape has really changed so much in the last 50, 75 years. If you think about, I often talk in my classes about, think back, 200 years, how people access their information. And in the past, before the internet, if you can imagine that time, people weren't accessing information the same way. It was primarily word of mouth, print media, books, newspapers, things like that. And as our world has changed, the information landscape has changed. So thinking about all those types of information that you can access, you have access to so much more. That landscape has literally changed. And I think it's so important for us to pay attention to that and realize that that's the culture we live in. Many of us have smartphones, and that's like carrying a computer in our pocket to get that information. And so I think it's changed in the last 50 years or more probably, but as technology has changed, it's really just changed so much of how we access that information.
Yeah, absolutely. Would anyone else have anything to add to how we got to this point where things like disinformation and misinformation are so prevalent?
I think I would just add, it continues to change. I just pitched a story to my editor about AI in the classroom, and I barely understand that myself. So I think the pace of it, as somebody who's supposed to be an expert in kind of understanding sources and vetting them and someone who works in the media, I struggle. I have to do a lot of checking for this. Like Rachel said, I mean, there's always been misinformation. There's always been disinformation, but the sources, of course, are a lot. There are a lot more, and they're changing so quickly.
Yeah.
I think that's something that I struggle with too. Is once you click on some misinformation or disinformation, and it follows you, and then it keeps sending you more stories of those things. As you try to dig out, it's kind of like quicksand, right? Where you're just like, what is real? What is true anymore?
Yeah.
And so I'm grateful for your book because it gives us some exercises to realize and see, maybe focus on things that we can exercise and help us to get out of that quicksand.
Yeah, absolutely. I often think of the idea, you keep using landscape, and I think of like an earthquake. And if you were to come back to a place that just had an earthquake, it might look completely different than it was before. And now the terrain, the maps have to change, everything has to look different. And in a lot of ways, that's what we're up against. Some of these cultural factors too of there's reasons why people might want to intentionally spread disinformation. It might have to do with money or power or votes or all the different things that can come from that. And other times I look at some disinformation and I think somebody needs a better hobby. I don't know, but there's lots of reasons and now there's just more access to the ability to share it than there ever has been. So it's not probably new that people are sharing misinformation or disinformation, but now it can spread so widely.
And I'll just add one more thing. I think part of what has also added to this landscape that we didn't have before is the uncurated nature of it. So we talk a lot about algorithms and how that you don't always control what you see.
Yep.
That's kind of what you were getting at, I think. And what we see on social media, what we see when we're searching online, we don't get to choose what we see. And there are these companies that are putting out social media apps and all of this. I mean, I don't want to paint it all as bad, but we don't always get to control. It's very uncurated. And so that creates a landscape where it's just there. And those algorithms create spaces where what you see is different than what I see is different than what you see. And we're literally seeing different landscapes sometimes.
Yep, absolutely.
Which also can create a lot of issues.
That's a really good point. So the next question that I have is kind of jumping right into this as the topic of the book starts with the word faith. So I'm going to ask Pastor Gary to answer this first question, and I just really so respect him, and he's very thoughtful. So why should tackling the subject of misinformation matter for people of faith?
Thank you for the question. That's a huge question, and I was actually chatting with my staff today, and they all looked in the air and said, "What do you have that question? It's a proper question." It is difficult, but three things came to mind when I read the question. It is three things that should trigger us to want to wrestle. One is truth. The other one is love.
Yeah.
And the other is credibility. Jesus says that I am the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the way, the truth, and the life. If Jesus is the truth and we are supposed to be more and more like him, we should be aiming for truth at all costs.
Yeah.
I was in a church one day, and it'll be a quick story. I know I'm a preacher, so that's a lot.
Yeah.
We went to, my wife and I went to this church, and the preacher got up, and preachers get into what they're doing sometimes, and this preacher preached from Philippians chapter 16, and do I have a Bible reading? That's the problem, right? Fake news. Preacher from Philippians chapter 16, it doesn't exist. But when someone is giving you information whether intentionally or unintentionally, we lose our credibility.
Yeah.
And so if we are designed by God to share him, if we are called by him to Matthew 28, verse 19, right? Go and make disciples of all nations. If that is our calling, that is our commission, why would someone listen and believe what we have to say if we're sharing an article that is not true? Share something that is unloving. We're speaking something that is not of God and his purpose. So those 3 things I want to highlight, and I'm sure it's time for me to.
There is a Matthew 28. I would like to. There's definitely a Matthew 28. Really, that really happened? And nobody said anything about how he was preaching from a chapter that doesn't exist?
I mean, my eyes are probably as large as they are right now. I'm looking around and no. Everybody's like, preach.
Wow.
Not the church for us.
Yeah, no. Any other responses for those of you who, open it up to anyone? That was really good, so it might be tough. 3 points you knew as pastor right away. Go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say, that's why I go to his church.
That's why he's your pastor. Yeah, good. I think as a pastor, the only thing I would add, because I love that, that's the 3 points right there. But we have to just keep remembering that everything that we're experiencing is forming us. We love to think that only a spiritual formation activity that we have signed up for, that we are intentionally reading, or a podcast that we chose. But when we listen to how Rachel is talking about the way in which all of these algorithms are giving us different information, and how everything is changing and all of this, we are being formed all the time. And so I actually loathe the idea that some sort of marketing is forming me, but that is a reality that I need to deal with and we need to confront, and that's really tough. But then to think that beyond marketing, it's misinformation or disinformation, and that it does form us. It's not neutral. What we consume is not neutral, and that's daunting, but means that we have the opportunity to step into this, and I think those 3 points really help anchor us, is what I feel like from what you said. So thank you for sharing that. Absolutely. Okay, so third, and I'm gonna call out specifically those who are working in journalism here. Most of us are on the receiving end over here of the information from the media. So of course, we have an opportunity to share information ourselves more than we ever have through social media. But when it comes to the professional media, I want to ask the journalists and those who are involved in work in journalism on the panel to give us a glimpse into what this struggle with misinformation is like in your industry. I think the most about what it's like for me on the receiving end. But Elizabeth, could you start with what is this like? You mentioned a little bit, but give us a glimpse to what this is like as a journalist.
Well, I think there's a couple ways to answer that question. One way is, you use the term media literacy, so that's something we're kind of internally constantly talking about. How do we make the information that we're reporting on and presenting, how do we make it really clear? And so I've reported on information and disinformation before. Professionally, I talk a lot with my editor about how to, when I'm doing that reporting, how to distinguish between people that are spreading misinformation versus people that are spreading disinformation, and I report differently on those 2 areas. But we do, we're kind of constantly talking about our own bias, kind of how to look at that and how to set up systems to kind of guard against that and be open about that, and have checks to have an editor. If I have a source, but I know that source personally, letting my editor know, maybe handing that story off to someone else. If I know that I'm particularly biased in a certain situation, again, letting my editor know, having a discussion, being really open about that. So it's just kind of constantly a thing. And again, kind of what I said before about things changing so quickly, trying to really educate ourselves about misinformation, and the different ways that it can spread, disinformation, and the different ways that it can spread. So that's one way I think of, how we're affected by this. And of course, just really trying to do things like this and talk about, what, again, media literacy and the importance for people to understand the work that I do and the, the limits of that work and the process behind that work to give people who are consuming that information the tools. It's a tool, right? Information is a tool, and to give people the information they need to use that tool in ways that make sense for them and are helpful. So those are some of the ways that, I'm constantly thinking about this, and my colleagues are constantly thinking about this. And of course, there's always the correction, a favorite tool, right? We make mistakes too, and try to be transparent about those, and point out where we make mistakes. So,
yeah, great. I'm thinking about to the two others in journalism here. Anything you'd add to how this affects? Think about. I know it's been a long time since 2021, when you were running a media company. A couple thoughts on what that was like to deal with this pervasiveness as this has grown and changed?
Well, first, Rachel, thank you for the book. It was wonderful. It is wonderful. It's rich. It's full. I will endorse it entirely. You'll enjoy it when you read it. I'm not a practicing journalist, nor do I lead a journalistic organization, so this is entirely my opinion.
Great.
I think journalists today have an incredibly difficult job.
Yeah.
Just a massively hard job. And a huge responsibility. In her book, Rachel draws out and makes reference to the difficulty, not surprising to many of us, I suppose, the difficulty for some people to distinguish a fact from an opinion.
Yeah.
We might all have that. We might have all been challenged by that at one time or another. We thought it was a fact, and it turned out, just because it was repeated often and confidently and from a source that we trusted, it turned out not to be actually a fact.
Yeah.
We depend on journalists to help us distinguish between a fact and an opinion. And opinions are not beliefs. I mean, in this faith context, opinions are different than belief. But we are confused by that as well. Because both of them, if you say an opinion with the deepest of conviction, it starts to sound like something other than an opinion. So I think journalists have an incredibly difficult job today. First, to determine what sources are credible and to do the hard work of fact-finding, which is all over the book. Respect journalists that, and Elizabeth has mentioned a couple of times, her editor, respect journalists that subject themselves to the work of an editor.
Yeah.
That's really important. And how many sources do I use or consume every day? How many do you consume where there's no editor involved? So I think, and I'll leave it there, but I think journalism today has an incredibly difficult job, and it's never been more important to do it well.
Yeah.
And it's never been more important for us as a community, us as citizens, us as people of faith. It's never been more important for us to determine which journalists and journalistic organizations are trustworthy and are daily seeking to earn our trust.
Yeah, absolutely. So wonderful. Ben, you're in this really specific situation as we described these. It's very specific because it's faith-based Christian radio, but then the context we just described of how many different places are hearing this. And my understanding is a lot of your role is deciding what programs will or will not end up finding slots and different things like that. Tell us a little bit about your perspective of what that's like for you, because you're in an explicitly faith space, but also representing media.
Right. Well, I think prior to working at Faith Radio, I worked at a commercial radio group, and you see it all over the place where, you've heard that phrase, if it bleeds, it leads, and we want people to listen longer or watch longer or tell their friends about it and get more ratings. And at Faith Radio, we just believe in Philippians 4, verse 8, which is a part of Philippians, right?
There is a Philippians 4.
Yeah,
Could we get someone with the Pew Bible? Thank you.
And we want to focus on what's true and what's noble and what's right and praiseworthy. And so I had a conversation with somebody today who was challenging me on some information that they heard, and it was a little bit of misinformation and a little bit of disinformation, and it's a battle, and it's moving faster and faster and faster, and it can be exhausting. And so we look to God for renewal and refreshment and perseverance to get it right all the time. But we don't want to lose influence on our radio station and our ministry, and so we want to be able to impact the widest group of people possible, and that means telling the truth and pointing people to Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one more thing I'd add, it's something I think a lot about, and I'm always trying to get better at, is the quality of information. So something can be accurate, but it could be biased, it can lack context.
Yeah.
And so something I'm always trying to do better in my job is, in both the way I consume information and the way I present information, is really thinking about how I'm framing stories, the context, the voices. That can make a really big difference. An example I was thinking about on the drive here is I just did 2 stories about some of the laws that were passed in the legislative session, and one I had a little bit more time and expertise in, and the other I had like a day and like very little expertise. So
Wow.
my focus is in K-12 education, so I have a lot of good sources that I've built a relationship with. I know their work. I spent time really in this world, and I understand good questions to ask. I feel very comfortable. And the other one was in early education that I've done like a few stories in and have much less expertise. And I also had a lot less time to do that story. And so both stories that I did were accurate, but the K-12 story had, I would say it had better context in terms of I had more time to interview, for example, the people that were affected by some of the laws that were changed. And so and I use that as well as again, they were both accurate, no corrections. But even as a consumer, as a reporter, I'm looking at this story. What's missing? Do we have, information on who's affected by this? Who are the sources and where are they coming from? And, Rachel goes through some of this in her book, how to look up sources and understand, some of their background information, maybe some of their motivations. Just having that as, it can really affect the quality of the information.
That's really, that's helping me think differently about that, because 2 things can be absolutely true but cause a way different reaction, and can we consider how that's going to happen? And I had never heard if it bleeds, it leads. That's disturbing. I personally have not heard that. And I bet there's other little anecdotes about that would be shocking as well. So thank you for that. That's helpful. Okay, I want to just zoom out a little bit for a minute, and then we'll zoom back into the details, okay? So I recently was talking with John. So John's been a mentor to my brother and I, and you shared something with me, and I wanted to bring this back to you to ask you to elaborate on it a little bit. You said so much of our macro civic, cultural, social, and political landscapes have become contests of belief, and most media amplify all of this. So once again, as somebody who now does not represent any media industry or any organization, you have experience in the industry, but you are not currently. What do you think is at stake for society if we continue down this path of so much disinformation and misinformation?
Well, I should learn to be careful what I tell Stephanie. Well, let me ask you all, it's rhetorical, but what if, as a society, as neighbors, as people living in the same place with a common good, what if we can't really tell the difference between a fact and an opinion? What happens then? When I said that this is a contest of beliefs, I didn't say a contest of opinions, although it's that as well. Opinions ostensibly should be based on fact or experience. We all have our experience. I have an opinion about it. I have facts. I have an opinion about it. But opinions are temporal. They can change. I can change my opinion about something. It's much harder to change belief. Belief is not necessarily permanent, but it's much deeper. It's a conviction. And beliefs aren't based on facts. Beliefs are based on morals and values and faith. And so what I experience as a news consumer and what I experience as just a person alive today is most of the debate, most of the contest, most of the struggle, most of the tugging and pulling and the toing and froing and the shouting isn't really fact-based. It's either opinion or belief. And so I have a different emotional response to it. I'm actually affected differently personally. I take it in differently when I understand that what is happening in front of me is a contest of belief or a contest of a contest of opinion. So, and this is a perfect time for me to say, I think Rachel provides a wonderful path into that question in the book. And I'll tell you, because I'm going to read it to you, page 141. It's my favorite passage in the book. You don't mind me doing this, do you?
Don't mind.
We grow as human beings when we question the world around us, when we're willing to look a bit deeper and at the nuance of a situation. This involves a level of curiosity for ourselves and the world around us. If we want to find new perspectives and be willing to find the nuances of a situation, we need to practice curiosity. When there is a contest of belief and there's a contest of opinion, I find curiosity lacking. I find it absent. And one of the things that I try to do, I'm not great at it, but I'm getting better at it, is try to respond to that contest with curiosity. Not with my own belief, not with my own opinion, but with a question. Yeah. Just to take a pause. Sometimes the question is, do I agree with that? Sometimes the question is, what can I learn from this? But ask myself a question, because I think, and thank you again, curiosity opens a door for a lot that just a contest of belief and a contest of opinion closes off. And I experience so much of what I see, read, hear as a contest of beliefs, rarely a contest of fact. Yeah. And when not a contest of belief, it's a contest of opinion. Yeah. And knowing that, I give myself permission to respond differently to that contest. I don't feel as obliged to jump in. I don't feel, whether it's online or whether it's in real life, whether it's in my family or whether it's with total strangers, if my first response can be, and I'm not great at it, but if my first response can be curiosity, then the contest itself takes on a completely different role for me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's so good to differentiate between the belief and the opinion and the fact. And maybe even that alone, the pause long enough to wonder about, what am I looking at? What am I reading? Is this a belief, an opinion, or a fact? And how would I get more information? As of course, there's tips to do that. But that pause is really helpful.
And our lived experience is a fact. We are all experts on what we have experienced.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily universal.
Right.
Just because I've experienced this doesn't mean everyone who has had a similar experience had the same experience. Expertise, facts. When I was in a journalistic organization, we talked a lot about respecting an objective fact and respecting experiential fact. Yeah. Everyone can talk confidently about their own experience. Journalist's job is to understand and discern whether that experience can be universal, whether that experience is shared in common, whether my experience actually has relevance for others. Right. So.
Yeah, and being curious about someone's story and their experience. You can't disagree with somebody's experience. You could disagree with their conclusions. You could have different opinions about the conclusions that they have. But we're jumping in sometimes before someone has even just shared the story and haven't even gotten to the conclusions yet.
Well, I've been married 43 years, and my wife and I have a lot of experiences in common, and it still never ceases to amaze me that we can go to the same restaurant, have pretty much the same experience, and have a totally different conclusion about it.
Yeah, there it is. Anyone else want to jump in on this just question of like what's at stake? And I mean, giving us an opportunity just to imagine what would happen if we really continue to go where we can't determine fact and fiction in some of this. But any other comments of just what's at stake when it comes to this?
I'll say, I'll try to be brief. And that is, we continue down the road of otherizing. Yeah. Everyone becomes an opponent or an enemy. And then we continue to isolate. Yeah. And so, that's from a spiritual perspective. God did not create us to be alone. He created us to be in community. And I'll leave it there because I'll bleed into the next question.
But yes, we will continue to isolate and differentiate. Yeah.
Yeah, this is just all making me think in terms of what's at stake. A lot of the conversations I've had with folks as I was writing this book, as I've been doing these workshops, it almost always comes down to relationships. Yeah. And that people are wanting to do their fact checking, or they want to understand things because they're in relationship with people, and they're trying to navigate their relationships with people who literally are seeing different information. And so I think to your point, it's like what's at stake is our communities, our relationships, our being together, because we're separating ourselves, and we're putting ourselves into different situations and different information that we can no longer have that community.
Yeah, good. Elizabeth, were you going to add anything?
Oh, I've had this discussion with an editor when there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there, and at what point do we report on it? When is it a story? And one of the things we've discussed is when it starts to affect people, so the reporting that I've done is some of the reporting that I've done is looked into that, and it has a big effect. It has a big effect on at least the specific reporting I've done, a big effect on communities, on people's ability, people's jobs. People get fired over misinformation and disinformation. People lose relationships over it. A lot of money is wasted. I report on schools. Kids are affected by it.
Yeah.
It has very real world consequences. So anyway, and that's when I report on it.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so the next question I have, I'm going to toss to Ben at first. So I've been noticing in myself that I have a tendency, kind of back to that otherizing. This is a problem other people have. I need to help them figure out why they have this problem, and this kind of wanting to point towards the other group or the other folks, or they're the ones that are perpetuating this, or I'm somebody who wants to see the truth, but I am not somebody that can do anything about this. Personally, it's really the other people that are having a problem. And recognizing the need for the self-reflection and the need to pay attention to, wait a second, if everybody's thinking that, herein lies the problem. And so I want to just toss this question to you, Ben. Rachel's encouraging us to look internally and to look at our own hearts in this, and our bias and our group affiliations and all that comes with that, to consider how we might be perpetuating the problem. What does it look like to confront bias in our lives and to be honest with ourselves about our blind spots?
I'm grateful for that question, and thank you, Rachel, for walking us through this in your book. I think, I can only explain my past, and I know that I was part of misinformation and disinformation, and I found joy in it because I liked riling people up. I thought it was fun, it was interesting. And when I recommitted my life to Christ in 2009, I took an examination of myself and realized that is I'm losing influence by that. I'm riling people up, and I'm not doing what Christ is calling me to do. And so it is a self-examination, and it is looking at everything that you post online. And I've come to the case of maybe not even posting online as much, because what is true? What is noble? What is praiseworthy? And so it is an ever-changing landscape that is quicker and faster, and I only want to put out what is true. I only want to help instead of hurt.
Yeah.
I don't want to create the spin to be even faster, because there is plenty of that happening. One thing that I've noticed, though, that with people that are doing, because I didn't do it well, and so I've taken a step back at it and tried to learn, is just ask questions to people that are posting and taking part in some of this stuff, and everybody just wants to be heard. And I feel like people are passionate with what they post, whether they believe it or doing it on purpose. They really believe, and they're doing it. Just ask questions and connect with them and love them. We had some research recently that said a certain percentage of people think that the pandemic is over, and they were calling us to forgiveness and to have conversations with people that, whether you were pro this or anti this, and you've posted that or you've posted this, to come back to the table and to have conversations, to listen, to connect, and to grow, because there is a loneliness epidemic.
Yeah.
And we really believe that the devil is sitting back there, just snickering, going, as I can separate the sheep from the flock, I can take off one by one, and I can take this whole thing down. And so the devil is in the details, and he's working hard as he possibly can to separate us and make us as lonely as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Pastor, anything you would add to that?
I think that when we talk about blind spots,
Yeah.
I think about myself when I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror.
there's a whole big blind spot all back here. And I need my wife to let me know that I look like a fool all back there. And I think that that's what how we need to approach all of life, but specifically when we're talking about news and information, that we can't see our own blind spots.
Yeah.
So yes, we can self-evaluate, but we need to be a part of trusting community, people who are not afraid to call us out on our stuff. You told me I couldn't curse. The people who are...
This is online.
You're a pastor.
Yeah. Pastors never
All
curse.
have-
Pastors never curse. Go ahead.
All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Yeah, so I just wanted to emphasize the value and importance of community and surrounding ourselves with community who is not like us, who does not believe or even have the same opinions as us. No echo chambers, right? My best friends are absolutely different than me. My wife is, I'm like, how are you so different? How are we attracted? But opposites attract, right? But we are able to help each other.
Yeah.
And those people that are around me really help me to be a better me.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else to add? It's important to do that, but it's difficult, and it's difficult to take the time and the energy to confront our own biases. It's just so, it takes a lot of mental, emotional, and spiritual energy to do that, and we've got our energy being pulled in all different directions. And so I love the invitations we're talking about pausing and being curious and talking about saying maybe that means if I don't have time to do the due diligence, then I don't have time to post this now. And what would that mean for us to pull back and to pause in that way? And I just think that's so good, and to be willing to interrogate our own thoughts a little bit when it comes to that. Okay, so of course, I really want to encourage everybody to get this book in a minute, so I don't want us to get into all the details so you think that you don't need it, so we won't go there. But before we go and before we conclude, I just want to have a little bit of advice and encouragement from the panel on like these kind of two questions, and I'll let Rachel start first. First, what steps can we take to be intentional not to spread fake news ourselves, besides buying the book? Right, okay. Secondly, how might we approach others in our lives we care about who we see sharing fake news, perpetuating disinformation and misinformation?
Yeah, those are really good questions, and what I feel like actually a lot has already been said. One of the things that I always start with before I ever, and it comes first in my book, before we even talk about how do you know if that image is accurate, or how do you know if that author is an expert, before we even go there, I always start with ourselves, like you said, and literally noticing our emotions. And this is something that I think in our culture we're not always very good at. Our online spaces don't encourage this. There are a lot of studies that show that emotional content spreads faster online, and therefore and misinformation is often emotional. Right. And so the first thing I always start with is noticing your emotions when you're online. Notice your emotions when you're on social media. Notice your emotions when you're reading the news. Not because they're bad to be upset, or happy or whatever, but because if we can take that pause, it gives us a moment to decide how we're going to respond and whether or not we're going to share that story or whether we're going to look up the author and see if they're an expert, right? It's that pause. Noticing your emotions and paying attention to them is like literally my first tip, because I think that that's the part that we're not always doing. I know I'm not. I'll be scrolling like anybody else, and it's really easy to get sucked into like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened, and I haven't even like paused to read the whole story. I'm just going off the headline. And there are great journalists doing great work, and also we can do our part to say, hey, am I pausing? Am I noticing? Am I paying attention to myself? And so I think that's my first tip, and actually my biggest one. I feel like that's the most important thing we can do, is pay attention to ourselves before we try to engage. And then for your second question about how do we talk to people, I mean, that's really what I think everyone's asking. and that there are conversations I had with people in 2019 before I even started these classes that my friends were saying that. How do I talk to someone? My parents read this news story and I don't know how to talk to them about it. We think different things on this topic, and I don't think I have all the answers because I struggle with the same thing. I have friends and family that I don't always agree with, and it's really hard to know how to talk to them. But I think that part of it is kind of like you were saying, is being curious. I know when I'm willing to ask a question, the conversation goes better than when I try to say, well, actually, let me share this with you. The questions are going to go better. And I talk a lot in the book about also us as people of faith practicing humility and saying maybe we don't have all the answers. And I think approaching conversations with that posture can go a lot farther than us saying, well, actually, we know all the answers. Here you go. I think we can have a more rich conversation, and our relationships can grow from that more than if we don't. And I guess the last thing I'll add is I think it's small. I think it can start small. I think sometimes when we think about how do we talk to people who have a different opinion than us, or how do we talk to someone that believes this misinformation, I think sometimes there can be this pressure like we need to convince them now. And I think there's something to be said for choosing to go slowly and not feeling like we have to just convince them today, but maybe taking the time to have multiple conversations and being courageous and recognizing that as courage. I think it can also be easy to say like, well, I'll try, but like really like that's something to celebrate. I mean, even for myself a few weeks ago, I like pushed back on some misinformation that someone was sharing, and it was really small, but it was the first time I had done that, and I paused and like noticed like that was good that I did that, and not to downplay the small moments, because I think they can be really important.
Yeah, that's so good. Anyone else? Some tips, some ideas?
I'll add an and. I thought that was great. In as much as we must be more aware of our own emotional response to things, great advice I got, and when I practice it, it works, and I'm not great at practicing this. When I'm more intentional about how I want the other person to feel, sociological studies have proven that we remember a bit about what people say, a bit more about what people do, but we remember a lot of how they made us feel.
Right.
So if we know that if I know the lasting impression that I'm going to make on this individual or on this group is how they feel, I should be more intentional about how I want them to feel. Do I want them to be upset about this? Do I want them to feel alienated? Do I want them? This is the relationship part that some people have mentioned so importantly. Taking that pause, being aware of how I'm feeling about it, and then for me to be very intentional about how I want you to feel as a result of my communication or as a result of my engagement. Especially, even if that's online. How do I want this person to feel? How do I want all these people that are going to read this to feel? If I'm going to ask myself that question, I'm much more likely to have that influence my behavior.
Yeah, that's good.
All right, I want to add 3 more P's to your pause. Is this preaching? Right. So what we do at Faith Radio is we pause, and then we make sure that we're pure with our intentions. Then we're patient in our approach, and we persevere because it matters.
Oh, do it again. Say it again.
So pause, to just take a step back, take a second, realize what's going on, be pure with your intention. What were the other? No, I'm just kidding. Be patient with your approach, and persevere because it matters.
Wow.
So
that's helpful. Any other thoughts?
You could write a whole book about this.
Yes, you could write a whole book about this.
Somebody did.
Thank you
She's
for the people
right
that
here.
laughed at my joke.
That was really good.
I thought about that one.
That was a good one.
I think, when I'm, a lot of my job is sourcing information, which is super complicated. Rachel goes over a bunch of it in her book. But just really quick stuff, right? Like scrolling through social media. Does the person mention their source? are they presenting it as a fact? Or are they presenting it as an opinion? Do they know the difference? Do you know the difference? And what are they sharing their source? And then go look at the source. And that's always step one for me.
Yeah, that's so good. You go ahead.
I'll just say that I always want to ask, is this honoring God?
Yeah.
Like, would Jesus share this post? Would he have this conversation right now? How would he approach it? And what you said was beautiful about how does it going to make someone else feel. Like, if I am a Christian, I believe in loving someone else, and I care about their well-being, their life, how they feel. I care about the relationship.
Yeah.
I want to build the relationship and not destroy it, right? But I would also, last tip is to look back into history and see how fake news, misinformation, disinformation has completely destroyed communities, oppressed people,
Yeah.
and destroyed human life,
Yeah.
right? Go back to the 17th century, Gomez de Zurara and his publication of what his opinion of black people, Africans, was, and how that thought was published in books and spread throughout Europe and gave people permission to now go in and dehumanize people. And we're still dealing with the problem today. And so if we don't make ourselves or avail ourselves to educating ourselves in how to consume media and distance ourselves from confirmation bias. Don't just look for opinions that fit your narrative, your feelings, your desire, what you want the story to say. We have to be more careful, or else we're on a path to destruction.
Yeah.
So it has great implications, and I love your book because it's incredibly practical.
Right.
It's not some big theory and, I know everything. It's, let's get down in the dirt and try this together.
Yeah.
And we will be better people from it.
Amen. That's so good. I think the one thing I think about just really practically is we use the word online space. And I think it's difficult I do remember before the internet was a thing in our everyday life. I do remember that. And I think it's hard to remember that is a space just like this is a room that is a space. And our living rooms are a space. And it helps me when I think, would I have this conversation in my living room with a group of people or in my backyard with all of these people? And if I did, how would I want them to feel if they were in my home? You're welcoming people into your online living room. And thus, also, if they post something into your living room and you don't want it there, it doesn't have to stay there. It's your living room. You can take it out. And that's different than a public forum, right? So when we think about space, it helps me to think, okay, would I say this? How would I say this if I was in my living room? And how would I maybe act differently with the many faces and those little avatars of all these people? These are human beings, and we are in a space that's an intentional space. And then the other thing I always think about, I was a psychology major, so I remember the first day they started talking about reptile brain. And that's when your brain, kind of short circuits and the deep thinking goes away, and then you're reactive instead of responsive. And I've made it a rule in my life as much as possible is that if my heart rate is up, I shouldn't say anything or post anything or respond to that email, or because you can get the heart rate down and you can return to it. So I might not be able to do that in a one-on-one in the same way. I might have to stay, try to calm down and have a conversation. But one of the blessings of the internet or the ways we communicate in other ways is that we can be thoughtful and pause in different ways than we ever have been. And so if your heart rate's up, get an Apple Watch or something. If your heart rate's up, pause and don't post, don't communicate. If you can, what a blessing to not have to communicate with your reptile brain. Well, that's a great thing. But I have done that with my reptile brain, and it doesn't just affect me. I'm embarrassed, and then there's a long-term effect, and the ripple effect of that negativity goes a long way, hundreds of years. But I want to encourage us that the ripple effect of us being intentional and thoughtful and having those slow, patient conversations, that ripple effect goes a long way too. And that's what I think is the encouragement about this, and what makes me feel like it's worth getting down into the dirt and doing this together. So thank you so much to the panel. Rachel, do you have any final just thoughts for everybody before we send them off?
Yeah, I mostly just want to say thank you all for being here. Thank you for hosting this stuff. And just thank you for engaging with this topic. I know as I started this work 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago now, I was looking for a way to bring intentionality and mindfulness and a slowing down to these spaces that feel really fast. They feel really overwhelming. They feel stressful, I think, to a lot of people. How do I engage online? How do I do this well? What's true? What's not true? What should I pay attention to? And I never wanted to give people black and white answers. Go here, don't go there. What I was hoping, and what I hope you heard tonight, because I think this panel did such a good job, is that you could see the gray in all of these spaces, that it's not always easy, but it's worth it. In one of the classes, actually the class I did for Mercy Vineyard, because I had the opportunity to do my class with them in 2021, I think. I was talking about having grace for people, I was talking about gray spaces, and I was saying, how can we find these gray spaces online? How can we move past the black and white and find the gray? And someone interrupted me and was like, I'm so sorry, because it was Zoom, and it was early days of COVID, so Zoom was still like kind of crazy.
We were working on it.
Somebody interrupted me and said, are you saying gray spaces or grace spaces? And I have come back to that over and over again, is that these online spaces, we can bring grace to them.
Yeah.
And we can bring intentionality, and we can be mindful in ways that people don't expect. And for those of us that are Christians and people of faith, that is how we can respond differently. And we can be countercultural. It is countercultural. It feels countercultural because it is countercultural. And so that's the last thing I'll say, is just, it's hard, but it's worth it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't always have to be as hard as I think we make it out to be. Yeah. But yes, thank you all for being here. Thank you for everyone on the panel. Thanks, Steph. Thank you for engaging with this topic. It's hard, but it's worth it. And I believe that God wants this from us, to engage mindfully in our world in a loving and kind way, and not be part of spreading misinformation is not loving our neighbors. And so I think this is our chance to love our neighbors really well.
Amen. Can we thank the panelists? We'll allow you all to slip right out here and into the great room quickly, and then would love for you to join us over there. We've got some wonderful refreshments that are for everyone, and then some books will be there for sale. If you brought a book with you, you can have Rachel sign it, and then we'll be able to enjoy the night. Please bring any of your questions and comments and continue the conversation. Thanks for being here.